5 minutes past 8 Central African time. Still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salayelo Makwidir. And our first story, we'll be heading over to Burkina Faso. And I can guarantee you it's a coincidence. It's not because Banyana beat them at yesterday's WAFCON game. Foot is very, very excited. But yeah, that's not the case. We're talking politics, which is totally different from sport, even though some argue that they intersect. But Burkina Faso's military government has been placed under renewed international scrutiny. This is over what human rights groups describe as a deepening crackdown on civil society, the media, and dissent. But the government itself, led by Mr. Traore, argues that many of its measures are necessary to protect national sovereignty and to respond to serious security concerns. We know the case in that part of Africa and how coups have almost become the order of the day. So they're arguing that they're trying to contain that. But where do we draw the line between national security and the silencing of critical voices? And to help us unpack this, we're joined by Gwinyai Taruvinga, researcher at the Wits Faculty of Humanities. Gwinyai, good morning. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Welcome.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. Thank you, Selu. I hope you're well.
I'm well. Thank you so much. I want to jump right into it because at a surface level, for many Africans, Burkina Faso almost represented a new reimagined Africa. I don't know if it's PR or it's propaganda, the messaging and the wording that we're getting coming from that part of the continent. But looking at the latest developments, they seem to be giving us a different picture, from your perspective, looking at what is happening in Burkina Faso politically. How would you describe the country and why are we here? How did the country reach this point?
So I think there are two very interesting points that you raise in your question, and I think I want to address them in that way. The first being that of African leadership. So if we look at the history of the African continent, several leaders have been looked at in different ways. So for example, former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, is viewed as an African icon. But if you ask Zimbabwean citizens, they'll have something different to say. I think the same sort of applies to this particular case. With Ibrahim Traore, from a continental perspective, is viewed as an African leader who is standing against imperialism, who is standing against Western influence. And this is something that is well received by African citizens. However, when we then look at what is happening in Burkina Faso itself, we're often seeing that it's completely different. It's a far cry from the realities that the rest of the African continent would view Burkina Faso. So particularly in this case, what we're seeing is a military regime that is basically turning authoritarian based on the reports that we're receiving, basically tightening up this democratic space, basically cracking down on dissent. And I think this is the result of a military coup where it's all about power retention. And these are the dynamics that we're seeing in Burkina Faso.
You mentioned something quite important, the fact that this current leadership of Burkina Faso is there because of a military coup. And in the Sahel region of the continent, I mean, it has been dubbed the coup belt, because of the amount of coups that happen in that part of the continent. How about those that make the argument that, maybe, just maybe, the actions of the Burkina Faso government is to try and mitigate other coups that might stabilize the country even further? The fact that the crackdown on dissent and other voices within the country is a necessary evil to an extent?
Yes, I think those arguments are proffered by certain individuals. But I think what's important here is to understand the role that democracy plays, particularly in holding leaders accountable. So while on one end we can have a military regime that is, for example, able to deliver, this is just a layman's perspective that I'm giving, but we're looking at a military regime that will be able to deliver certain things to people. However, what we need to then focus on is how then do we hold that government accountable? How then do we prevent that government from abusing power as we're currently seeing? And this is why we often see that authors who talk about the importance of democracy focus on the fact that the idea is to hold leaders accountable. And without that mechanism that unfortunately I think democracy provides, it is then difficult for those leaders to be held accountable. And I think this speaks to some of the dynamics we're seeing in Burkina Faso currently.
And also that comes down to a question of democracy itself that you're raising. There are others, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here because these are conversations that you come across that also argue that democracy as a governing system in itself hasn't quite worked for the African continent. Maybe the likes of Burkina Faso are paving a way for a different kind of style of leadership, and maybe we shouldn't be judging it with the same lens that we are judging democratic states with, because who said democracy should be the norm and standard?
I quite like that point, and I would really invite you to attend one of my political studies lectures at some point.
Please,
because my students are always having this particular discussion, and I always want to point to the fact that when we look at the history of the African continent, what we know as democracy was something that we basically imported from Europeans. So essentially, this is what we inherited after the end of colonialism. However, we were not certain African countries, particularly Burkina Faso, that has a long history of French intervention, a long history of foreign intervention. You'll find that a country like Burkina Faso was not given the opportunity to be fully democratic. So I'll take you back to 1983 when Thomas Sankara was the leader of Burkina Faso. He came in through a military coup himself, but one of the things he tried to do was put Burkina Faso on a trajectory of economic development and economic independence. And it was external forces that then removed him from power through another military coup that then placed Blaise Compaoré as leader of Burkina Faso up until around about 2014. The point I'm basically trying to make is that in certain instances, particularly with Burkina Faso, the country was not given an opportunity to implement this idea of democracy. It was thwarted by external actors. And I think this is something that the African continent has continued to battle with, particularly this idea of external actors and their influence on the African state. So hence this particular discussion we're having on democracy, it often then ends up being, is it really working? It's mainly because of the dynamics that we see that are often linked to external actors like our former colonial masters, so to say.
I want to take a quick break. When we come back, I want us to hone in on Captain Ibrahim Traore and the conversation that I think we slightly touched on earlier. The fact that he remains quite popular in parts of Africa, especially among young people who see him, as you mentioned, standing up to Western influence and imperialism. But should we start asking difficult questions? I want to touch on some of the things that he introduced ever since he came into power. I mean, elections have been dissolved. There are no political parties. Boiling again to the question of democracy as a governing system. But then I want us to focus on him and if we're asking the right questions when it comes to Captain Ibrahim Traore, instead of falling into the PR and the propaganda, which has been the norm and the case when you mention his name over the years. But we'll do that after this.
You know, it's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
Right now, over 150 million children around the world are orphaned, facing hunger, hardship, and uncertainty. With Islamic Relief's Orphan Sponsorship Program, you can provide a child with access to education, nutritious food, essential healthcare, and a safe home. Your sponsorship is not just support, it's hope, security, and a brighter future. Be the reason an orphan child smiles again. Sponsor an orphan today with Islamic Relief.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Are you banking with convenience, transparency, and flexibility? With Al Baraka Bank's transactional banking account, you can enjoy convenient everyday banking designed around your needs. Benefit from zero fees on point-of-sale transactions and manage your banking easily through Al Baraka's secure mobile banking app and internet banking platform. From everyday payments to managing your personal or business banking, Al Baraka makes banking simple, transparent, and convenient. Visit albaraka.co.za to learn more. Al Baraka, your partner bank. Al Baraka Bank Limited is an authorized financial services and credit provider.
Rejuvenating media day by day. This is Salam Media.
17 minutes past 8 Central African time, and you're still tuned in to News and Views. Myself, Salailo Makwidire, and I'm having a really interesting conversation with researcher at Wits Faculty of Humanities, Gwinyai Taruvinga. And we're looking at Burkina Faso. If you just joined us, well, they've been placed on a human rights watch list. This is as Crackdown on civil society deepens. And Gwinyai, before we went into that short break, thank you so much for staying with us. I wanted us to almost look at Ibrahim Traore. You know, you mentioned that he's lauded across the African continent, especially among young people who see him as this upstanding leader who's standing up against Western influence. But, you know, I'm just looking at his record here and, you know, reading about some of the negative developments that he has introduced since coming to power in 2022 in that coup, and it's really, it's clear. It almost looks like we are dealing with another typical African dictator, and that's a conversation a lot of young Africans especially are not willing you know, to confront. I mean, democracy has been weakened. There's no elections anymore. There's been a crackdown on journalists and the media. Opposition and dissent have been restricted. The security crisis remains quite severe. There's serious allegations against government forces. Ethnic tensions have intensified. Humanitarian organizations face tighter restrictions when it comes to providing aid. And there's a growing personality cult and misinformation concerns around him. When are we going to start being honest with ourselves around this man?
So I think one of the
and I know a lot of young Africans are gonna hate me for this question, but
so in terms of the young Africans that you've mentioned, I think one of the things you'll find is that globally, and I think this is manifested through so many protests that we've seen around the world, where I think the youth particularly have grown to be frustrated with democracy because it hasn't promised, or the promises that it has proffered haven't come to fruition. So as a result of that, you'll find that a lot of the youth are likely to align with a leader like Traore, who's able to make these particular promises. Unfortunately, like I said at the beginning of our interview, in Africa, we tend to have this veneration of particular leaders, right? So our Julius Nyereres, our Kwame Nkrumahs, and our Robert Mugabes. But if you have to talk to the citizens of those countries, they'll have differing perspectives on these particular leaders. And this is what we are seeing with Ibrahim Traore, because based on that charge sheet that you just read, it doesn't seem like a democratic leader. But from a global perspective, and from particularly in Africa, He's revered because of the fact that we are growing, the youth is basically growing against this idea of democracy, but more moving towards this system where it's fighting against imperialism, which is what Traore represents. So I think this is where the crux of the argument is, to say he represents a figure that is fighting colonial entities. And this is something that the youth would really resonate with, because they're really frustrated with the old guard and how they've approached this idea of democracy. So I think this will help you in terms of understanding why he's revered. However, I think those facts that you read are also very important for us to really understand, because facts are what we should be working with. And this is, again, some of the things that we're seeing from Burkina Faso.
Well, the others argue that the facts that I mentioned, they are arguing that it's international criticism, which we all know it can be quite selective when it comes to African leaders and African countries, and it reflects a Western or neo-colonial agenda. How do you answer that question, and how should African societies also on the other side be able to engage with human rights concerns without simply dismissing them as foreign interference, as is always the case nowadays?
So I think I think I've done several interviews with you where we've had discussions about military coups, and a lot of them tend to go along the discussions that we're currently having at the moment. And I think we need to now look at the context of Burkina Faso, which is the fact that this was a regime that came in through a military coup. Burkina Faso has had a history of military coups, and I think this gives us an idea of how we are today. I think at the beginning of this interview, you sort of asked me, how are we here today? And I think this is something we need to take into consideration, to say that Burkina Faso has had a long history of military coups. And one of the things that a military regime does is often try to be authoritarian, because then they want to control the space. Hence this decline and shrinking of democratic space that has been led by this particular government that we're seeing. So I think it's important that we work with the facts, but more important, it's also important that we understand that a military regime works in a particular way, and it works through power retention, and it normally aligns, again, with that charge sheet you were reading a few minutes ago.
No, yes. Really concerning. And my other concern, at least, is the fact that, as Africans, we've been trying to make the point that we need younger leaders with fresher ideas, who are more in tune with what's happening on the ground, instead of the quote-unquote old guard, which has been in power for years upon years now. But it feels a bit concerning that you have a relatively younger leader like Ibrahim Traore, who has this charge sheet that I just read out. What kind of picture does that paint for the future of Africa, especially when we talk leadership, when it almost feels like it's a situation of same old? It doesn't matter what generation you come from, as long as you're in Africa and you find yourself in the echelons of power, this is almost expectation.
So actually recently, I think I wrote a paper on Burkina Faso, which will be published in September. It was part of a book that was analyzing governance in Africa. And one of the arguments I made, particularly concerning Burkina Faso, and I think it also applies to the rest of the African continent, is this idea of democracy that we are talking about. To say that one of the things that democracy gives us, and this is in theory, obviously the practice will be a bit different, but in theory, it allows us to have independent institutions. Our institutions oversee how our country functions, right? But more important, what democracy allows us is to change leaders. And unfortunately, in several African countries, I often argue to say that we have a shortage of former presidents in some African countries. And as a result of that, I think we see that everything now becomes about power retention, whereby even if a 38-year-old who comes into power, like Ibrahim Traore, he inherits institutions that basically are promoting a particular belief, which is power retention, it's highly unlikely that something will change. So I think, to answer your question, I would say that it's important that we have independent institutions and we have democratic structures that allow us to change presidents, allow us to change leaders, because I think this is what Africa needs in several states, where leaders need to come and go so that ideas continue to change, and this will allow us to develop our economies and our countries.
Very, very important. And finally, before I let you go, Gwinyai, if the current trajectory continues, what could be Burkina Faso's political and civic landscape look like over the next few years? I'm just, trying to look into a crystal ball here. It looks bleak.
Yes, I think it does look bleak, but again, we need to work with the facts. And I think again, if you look at the context of Burkina Faso, so from around about 1983 till about 1987, Thomas Sankara was leader. He was taken out through a military coup. From 1987 till about 2014, Blaise Compaoré was president. He was also taken out during a military coup. And then there have been subsequent coups leading up until Ibrahim Traoré becoming leader of Burkina Faso. So unfortunately, what happens with military coups is they beget more military coups, and this then becomes a process that then continues to unfold. And this is something that might continue to happen in Burkina Faso until at some point they return to civilian leadership, which is what Ibrahim Traoré had promised at the beginning of his reign. Unfortunately, that hasn't come to the fore yet. So at some point, if Burkina Faso can maybe go back to civilian leadership, maybe then we can maybe start having more constructive discussions about governance in the country. But until then, it's highly likely that we're going to continue to see a cycle of military coups.
Very, very scary. Gwinyai Taruvinga, thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Really appreciate it.
The pleasure is always mine. Have a good day.
There we go. Gwinyai Taruvinga, researcher at the Wits Faculty of Humanities, helping us understand the complex relationship between security, between sovereignty and human rights in Burkina Faso. And I want to engage with you, 061-766-0355, especially young Africans who are online, spend lots of time on the internet and social media. There's so much propaganda regarding Captain Traoré. And a lot of young people saying that's the kind of leader that we want. That's the kind of leader that all Africans should be aspiring to. But are we doing enough to read and educate ourselves about the realities on the ground in Burkina Faso? I mean, you heard Gwinyai there tell you that what we think we know about these countries and how we revere some of these leaders, if you do go to the countries themselves and talk to the citizens, they'll tell you a different story. And he made a really brilliant example about the former president of Zimbabwe, the late Robert Mugabe. He's lauded, one of the most educated presidents on the African continent, well-read, a statesman like no other. But the reality on the ground, you get to read about some of the atrocities in Zimbabwe and the economic collapse that happened under his reign, and the reason why Zimbabwe is what it is right now. It's different. So are Africans honest? Are we honest about leadership and the conversations that we have around leadership, or we still focused on a cult following kind of mentality instead of basing our assessment on facts? Interesting conversation to have. Going to take a quick break. We'll be back with you after this.